Some doors protect a single room, others lead to an entire world. Before the sun has risen over the hills of central Turkey, before the first birds have begun to call across the pale valleys, before the warm light of morning has touched the strange and ancient landscape of Cappadocia, there is a stillness here that is difficult to describe. It is not the stillness of emptiness. It is the stillness of something waiting, something patient, something that has been waiting, in fact, for a very long time. Imagine standing at the edge of this landscape in the last hour before dawn. The sky above you is a deep and gentle violet, fading slowly into the dark blue of the horizon. The air carries a coolness that belongs only to high desert mornings, thin, clean, carrying the faint mineral scent of volcanic stone. Around you, in every direction, the land rises and falls in shapes that seem almost impossible. Columns of pale rock emerge from the hillsides like the fingers of buried giants. Carved cones and spires of cream-colored stone stand in clusters, their tops worn smooth by centuries of wind. The locals have called them fairy chimneys for as long as anyone can remember, though the name was not given lightly. There is something genuinely otherworldly about standing among them in the pre-dawn, quiet watching their silhouettes emerge slowly from the darkness as the sky begins ever so gently to lighten behind the eastern ridges. Before we go through it, if this is your first time visiting History Sleepy Time, please consider subscribing so that stories like this one find their way to you every time we release something new. Leave us a comment below and let us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. Now, shall we go through the door? This is the region of Cappadocia, a broad and ancient plateau in the heart of Anatolia, in what is now the modern nation of Turkey. It sits roughly in the center of the country, far from any coast, elevated above the surrounding plains, and shaped by millions of years of geological history that we will visit together in the next chapter. But for now, simply stand here, feel the silence. Let your eyes adjust to the growing light, because there is something in this landscape that most travelers walk past without noticing, and it is the thing we have come all this way to find. On the outskirts of a quiet village, a village of modest stone houses, of dogs sleeping in dusty doorways, of bread baking in clay ovens before the rest of the world is awake, there is a doorway. It is not dramatic. It is not marked with any particular ceremony or decoration. It sits at the base of a low rise of rock, framed by stones that have been worn smooth by the hands of countless generations, its edges rounded by centuries of wind and weather. The door itself, if there is one, is simple, wooden or sometimes just an opening in the stone, darkened by shadow, revealing nothing of what lies beyond. From the outside, you might walk past it entirely. You might assume it leads to a cellar or a storage room, or perhaps a small cave where a shepherd once kept his tools out of the rain. There is nothing about this doorway, nothing about its size, its shape, its position in the hillside that prepares you for what it contains. Nothing that suggests, even remotely, that if you were to step through it and follow the passage beyond, you would descend not into a cellar or a cave or a small storage room, but into something so vast and so carefully constructed that it would take your breath away completely. But we are not going to step through just yet, not quite. First, Simply stand here and look at it. Let the sky above you continue its slow transformation from violet to rose. Listen to the wind moving across the surface of the plateau, a low, steady sound like the breathing of the landscape itself. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster calls. The smell of early morning carries dust and wild thyme, and the faint warmth of stone that has been slowly releasing the heat it stored from yesterday's sun. And now ask yourself, as you stand before this perfectly ordinary doorway in this perfectly ordinary hillside, a question that is anything but ordinary. What would drive thousands of people, not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands of men and women and children and elderly and infants, to abandon the open sky above them and descend, willingly, into the darkness of the earth? What kind of world would have to exist above the ground to make the world beneath it seem safer? What kind of patience, what kind of ingenuity, what kind of communal determination would it take not merely to hide underground, but to build, stone by stone, corridor by corridor, level by level, an entire city down there? This is the question that will carry us through everything that follows, and it begins, as all the best questions do, with an ordinary door. Step forward. Duck your head slightly beneath the stone lintel. Feel the temperature change immediately. The surface air, cool as it already was, gives way to something deeper and steadier, a coolness that does not shift with the wind, because it has not been touched by wind in a very long time. The light from the pre-dawn sky behind you reaches perhaps a meter or two into the passage, illuminating the pale cut stone of the walls, the carefully worked ceiling just above your head, the floor smooth and worn beneath your feet. Beyond that reach of light, there is darkness, not threatening, but complete. Absolute, the kind of darkness that has existed in this corridor for perhaps 1,000 years or more without interruption. Your footsteps on the stone floor produce a soft, careful echo, a sound that travels forward into the darkness and returns to you slightly changed, as though the corridor is breathing it back. The air smells of cool mineral earth, faintly damp, utterly still. There is no sound from above, no wind, no birds, no rooster, nothing but the quiet that belongs to the world beneath the world. The passage ahead slopes gently downward. The walls on either side are smooth, not rough-hewn like a natural cave, but carefully, deliberately shaped. Someone carved this. Someone stood here with tools and intention and removed this stone not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Necessary in a way that we have not yet fully understood. The passage curves slightly. The light from the entrance is gone now, not dramatically, but gradually, the way the light of day leaves the sky. You are in complete darkness, and somewhere ahead of you, somewhere deeper in the cool and silent earth, something extraordinary waits. What kind of world could exist beneath such an ordinary doorway? To understand why people chose to live beneath this particular landscape, you first have to understand how the landscape itself was made. And to understand that, you have to go back, not centuries, but millions of years, to a time when this part of Anatolia looked nothing like it does today. Imagine central Turkey as it was approximately 9 to 10 million years ago. The plateau that will eventually become Cappadocia is already elevated, a broad, relatively flat highland rising above the surrounding plains. But the defining event of this region's geological history has not yet fully played out. To the south and east, a chain of volcanoes, most notably the massive peaks that geologists now identify as Erciyes and Hassan, both of which still stand as prominent features of the modern Cappadocian landscape, are active. Deeply, powerfully, repeatedly active. Over the course of millions of years, these volcanoes erupt not in single dramatic events, but in long, slow, repeated episodes of extraordinary geological energy. What emerges from these eruptions is not primarily lava, though lava is certainly part of the story. What fills this landscape, what defines it, what ultimately makes it habitable in such a peculiar and underground way is ash. Volcanic ash in quantities that are difficult to comprehend, layers upon layers of fine, light material that falls across the plateau like pale grey snow and accumulates over time in deposits that can reach hundreds of meters in thickness. As this ash settles and compresses over thousands and then millions of years, it undergoes a gradual transformation. It solidifies, it binds together, it becomes what geologists call tuff, a soft, workable, relatively lightweight stone formed almost entirely from compressed volcanic material. Tuff is a remarkable substance. It is soft enough to be cut with hand tools, iron picks, chisels, wooden mallets, and yet hard enough, once exposed to air, to maintain its structural integrity for extraordinary periods of time. It does not crack easily under compression. It does not splinter the way granite or limestone might. And because it was formed from fine volcanic ash rather than from crystalline minerals, it tends to be relatively uniform in its composition, meaning that a person carving through a wall of tuff will encounter few unexpected obstructions. Few buried boulders or sudden changes in hardness that might derail a careful excavation. But the ash alone does not fully explain the famous landscape of Cappadocia. For that, you need water. Over the long geological periods following the volcanic activity, the plateau is shaped by rivers and streams and seasonal rains, water that gradually erodes the softer upper layers of tuff while leaving harder caprocks intact. The result, visible today across the entire region, is the extraordinary phenomenon of differential erosion. Harder stone on top, protecting softer columns of tuff below, producing the remarkable formations that have made Cappadocia one of the most visually distinctive landscapes on Earth. These are the fairy chimneys, those tall, narrow spires of pale stone topped with darker, harder caps of basalt or other resistant material. They stand in clusters across the valleys, sometimes dozens together, sometimes scattered individually across a hillside, their forms ranging from simple rounded cones to elaborate mushroom shapes to strange twisted pillars that seem to defy easy categorization. They have been forming slowly for millions of years, and they are still forming today, as wind and rain continue the patient work of erosion. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the remarkable coincidence, if coincidence is even the right word, between the natural properties of this stone and the human needs that would eventually drive people to carve into it. Tuff, as we have noted, is soft enough to work with relatively simple tools, yet durable enough to maintain its shape once carved. It is porous, which means it breathes. Air can circulate slowly through its structure, which has important implications for the underground spaces we will explore in later chapters. It is a good natural insulator, maintaining a relatively stable temperature underground regardless of the season, cool in summer, not excessively cold in winter, which makes it remarkably well suited as a material for long-term habitation. And it exists here in extraordinary quantities, covering the plateau to depths of sometimes 300 meters or more, giving any would-be excavator an essentially unlimited supply of raw material to work with. The Hittites, one of the earliest recorded civilizations to inhabit this region, flourishing here during the second millennium before the Common Era, were likely among the first to recognize the excavation potential of Cappadocian tuff. They carved simple storage rooms and shelters into the soft rock long before anyone contemplated anything as ambitious as an underground city. The Phrygians, who followed the Hittites in this region during the first millennium before the Common Era, continued the practice, carving facades and chambers into the cliffs. By the time the Persians, the Macedonians under Alexander, and eventually the Romans passed through this landscape, the tradition of using the stone as both building material and excavation site was already ancient. And yet none of these earlier inhabitants pursued underground excavation to anything like the depth or complexity that would eventually characterize Derinkuyu. For that ambition, for the decision to descend not 1 or 2 levels, but perhaps 8 or more, to create not a simple shelter, but a fully functioning underground city, something more was required. Something that the stone alone, however perfectly suited to the purpose, could not provide. That something was fear, not the generalized fear of the unknown that haunts all human history, but specific, documented, historically verifiable fear. The fear of armies moving across open ground, of raiders descending from the north and east, of periods of religious persecution that made surface life not merely uncomfortable, but genuinely, repeatedly, terribly dangerous. The full shape of that fear, who carried it when they felt it, and what it drove them to build, will unfold across the chapters ahead. But first, stand for a moment in the landscape itself. It is morning now, the sun has cleared the eastern horizon, and its light is falling at a low, golden angle across the fairy chimneys, turning their pale stone to warm amber and cream. The shadows are long and soft. The air is still cool, carrying that characteristic mineral clarity of the high Anatolian plateau. In every direction, the landscape speaks of deep time, of geological processes so vast and so slow that the entire span of recorded human history barely registers against them. And yet, embedded in this ancient landscape, shaped by millions of years of volcanic activity and patient erosion, are the marks of human hands, doorways cut into cliffs, windows carved in precise rows along the faces of rock columns, staircases descending into darkness. And beneath it all, extending downward into the pale tuff, in a network of passages and chambers and stairways and wells that we are only beginning to fully map, a city. Nature created the rock in its own slow and magnificent way. What happened next was entirely the work of human hands. Walk with me now into the passage, Let your eyes adjust slowly to the diminishing light. Let your hand, if you wish, rest lightly against the wall beside you. Feel the texture of the stone there, slightly rough beneath your fingertips, slightly cool, carrying the faint powdery quality of tuff that has not been touched in a very long time. The corridor is narrow enough that you are aware of the walls on either side, but not so narrow that it produces any feeling of constriction. It was designed this way deliberately, wide enough for a person carrying supplies to move efficiently through it, narrow enough that a single defender could hold it against multiple attackers. Every dimension of this place was considered. Every measurement reflects a decision. The passage slopes downward at a gentle but consistent angle, and as you follow it deeper into the earth, several things change simultaneously. The light from the entrance, already reduced to a pale suggestion behind you, disappears entirely. The temperature drops perhaps 2 or 3 degrees, a noticeable shift, pleasant in summer, acceptable in winter, consistent across all seasons in a way that the surface never is. The sounds of the world above, wind, birds, the distant movement of the village, fall away completely, replaced by a silence so absolute that you can hear the faint sound of your own breathing reflected back to you from the carved stone walls. And then the passage opens. Not dramatically, not into some vast cathedral space that announces itself with theatrical grandeur. It opens gradually, the ceiling rising slightly, the walls stepping back, until you find yourself in a room. A proper room, roughly rectangular, its walls cut cleanly from the living rock, its ceiling arched in a gentle curve that distributes the weight of the stone above it efficiently. The floor is level. In one corner, a channel has been cut into the rock, a drainage groove, precise and deliberate. In another, niches have been carved into the wall at regular intervals, each one the right size and shape to hold a clay oil lamp. This room was lit. This room was used, and this room is only the beginning. The excavation of Derinkuyu, the name means, in Turkish, something close to deep well, a description that proves to be considerably more modest than the reality, was not a single event. It was not the project of one ruler or one generation or one moment of crisis. It was an accumulation, a slow, patient, multi-generational effort that extended across centuries, each period of danger or displacement or need prompting another level of excavation, another corridor driven deeper into the welcoming tuff of the Cappadocian Plateau. The precise origins of the excavation remain a subject of ongoing archaeological and historical discussion. But the earliest phases of the complex are now generally associated with either the Phrygian period, roughly the 8th to 7th centuries before the Common Era, or possibly even earlier antecedents whose traces have been obscured by later expansion. What is documented through archaeological survey is that the complex as it exists today contains at minimum 8 distinct levels, descending to a depth of approximately 80 meters below the surface. The word "at minimum" is important here. Portions of the complex remain inaccessible to archaeologists and visitors, not because of any mystery or concealment, but because of very practical considerations of structural safety and conservation. Some lower passages are partially collapsed. Some chambers have not yet been fully assessed for stability. The work of mapping and understanding Derinkuyu is ongoing, and the researchers involved in that work proceed carefully as good archaeological practice demands. What has been mapped and documented, however, is already extraordinary enough to occupy us for a considerable time. Begin at the upper levels, where the earliest excavations appear to have taken place and where the spaces are largest and most accessible. Here near the surface, the rooms are relatively generous in their dimensions, storage areas, with carefully smoothed walls and carved shelving, spaces that show clear evidence of having been used for the preservation of food. Large ceramic jars could be set into recesses cut specifically to hold them stable. Grains, dried fruits, preserved meats, olive oil, all the staples of a community's survival could be stored here, cool and dark, and protected from the insects and rodents that would have plagued surface storage in the same climate. Adjacent to the storage areas, connected by low doorways that require a slight duck of the head to pass through, are the spaces that appear to have functioned as communal work areas. The evidence for this comes partly from the physical characteristics of the rooms, their ventilation positioning, their proximity to the surface, their size, and partly from the traces of activity that centuries of habitation left behind. Archaeologists examining these spaces have identified areas consistent with the processing of food, the grinding of grain, the pressing of grapes and olives. One area shows evidence of having contained a winery, the soft rock shaped around what appear to be pressing platforms, channels cut to direct liquid flow toward collection points. Even in the darkness, even beneath the earth, the ordinary work of daily life continued. Descend to the second level, then the third. The stairways connecting them are steep and narrow, deliberately so, as we will discuss more fully when we reach the chapter on defensive engineering. But they are also carefully cut, each step at a consistent height. The edges worn smooth by the passage of thousands of feet over hundreds of years. The walls of the stairwells are sometimes scratched with marks. Some of them appear to be simple tallies or orientation marks left by excavators or regular inhabitants, though the full interpretation of such marks remains a matter for ongoing research. By the third and fourth levels, the nature of the spaces changes slightly. The rooms here are smaller and more numerous, a shift from communal to domestic scale that suggests these were the residential quarters, the spaces where families actually lived during periods of extended underground occupation. The rooms cluster together in arrangements that echo, perhaps deliberately, the layout of a surface village. Small private chambers opening off slightly larger shared spaces, with access corridors connecting clusters of rooms in a pattern that would have allowed communities to maintain some degree of privacy and social organization, even under the extraordinary pressure of underground refuge. Imagine, for a moment, what it would have taken to create these spaces. A person standing in a room on the fourth level of Derinkuyu is surrounded on all sides, above, below, and in every direction, by stone that was removed piece by piece by human hands. There were no explosives. There was no heavy machinery. There were iron picks and wooden mallets and chisels, and there were the hands that held them. and there was the patience of people who understood that the work they were doing might take their entire lives to complete, but who understood equally that it was necessary. The process of excavation in tuff, while not easy, is considerably more manageable than working in harder stone. A skilled worker with appropriate tools can remove tuff at a reasonable pace. The material is soft enough to cut, but coherent enough to hold its shape once cut. The challenge is less the cutting itself and more the removal of the material. Loose tuff is heavy and takes up considerable volume, and getting it out of a deepening underground system requires a logistical effort that grows more complex with each additional meter of depth. Archaeologists believe that the excavated material was almost certainly used as building material on the surface, mixed with water to form a kind of mortar, or cut into blocks for construction. Nothing was wasted. Every kilogram of stone removed from the earth was put to use somewhere. Wells were dug, not simple wells, but carefully engineered vertical shafts that pierced multiple levels of the complex and could be sealed at any level by means of stone plugs to prevent water from being poisoned by enemies who might gain access to the upper levels. Ventilation shafts, narrow and carefully angled, were driven upward through the tuff to the surface, their openings concealed or protected, carrying fresh air down to the deepest inhabited levels. Kitchens were positioned specifically in relation to these ventilation systems, so that smoke from cooking fires could be directed efficiently upward and out without filling the living areas. The planning involved in all of this was not improvised or accidental. It was the product of accumulated knowledge, of lessons learned over generations of use and expansion, of a community that understood its own underground world with remarkable sophistication. There are spaces in Derinkuyu that resist easy categorization, large rooms whose precise function remains uncertain, corridors that appear to lead somewhere but whose destinations are not yet fully understood, chambers cut with a precision that suggests specialized use without making that use immediately obvious. This is not unusual in archaeology. The absence of certainty is not the same as the presence of mystery, and the researchers who work in these spaces are careful to distinguish between what the evidence demonstrates and what remains to be determined. What the evidence demonstrates clearly and consistently is this: the people who built Derinkuyu built it to last. They built it to be used, not once in a single crisis, but repeatedly over extended periods, by large numbers of people whose needs were not just physical, but social, spiritual, practical, and deeply human. They built it not as a tomb or a hiding place or a temporary shelter, but as a city, with all the complexity and intentionality that word implies. And as you stand in the cool, still air of these carved rooms, running your hand along a wall that was shaped by someone who lived perhaps 1,500 years ago, the thought that settles over you is not one of strangeness or unease. It is something closer to recognition. The proportions of these rooms are human. The decisions embedded in their design are human. The care evident in every smoothed surface and every precisely cut niche and every carefully positioned doorway is human in the most fundamental and affecting sense. The care of people who wanted to survive and who were willing to build an entire world underground in order to do it. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Derinkuyu is not how large it is, though it is extraordinarily large. It is not how deep it goes, though it goes very deep indeed. It is not even the sheer audacity of the enterprise, though that audacity is genuinely breathtaking when you sit quietly and consider it. The most remarkable thing about Derinkuyu is how thoroughly it was designed for the specific purpose of keeping people alive when the world above them was trying very hard to do the opposite. Every feature of this underground city, every doorway, every shaft, every passage, every stone, reflects a set of engineering decisions made by people who understood, with painful clarity, what danger looked like. And the engineering they produced in response to that danger remains, even by the standards of modern archaeological assessment, sophisticated beyond easy expectation. Begin with the most iconic feature of Derinkuyu, the rolling stone doors. At regular intervals throughout the complex, at the entrances to major sections, at the tops and bottoms of stairways connecting different levels, at the mouths of key corridors, the excavators left circular niches cut into the walls of the passages. From these niches, enormous disc-shaped stones could be rolled across the passage to completely seal it. These stones, sometimes called millstone doors because of their shape and the way they were moved, are typically between 1 and 2 meters in diameter, cut from the same tuff as the surrounding rock, and weighing in some cases more than half a metric ton. The critical detail is this: these doors could only be operated from one side. A person inside the sealed section could roll the stone across the passage and lock it in place using a central hole fitted with a bar or bolt. A person outside, an attacker, an invader, an army that had somehow found the entrance and forced its way into the upper levels, could not move the stone from the other side. The passage was physically blocked. The deeper sections of the city were inaccessible. And since the deeper sections were where the majority of the population was sheltering, the stone doors represented not merely a physical barrier, but a near-absolute guarantee of protection for everyone who had managed to descend below them before they were closed. The design is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. An attacker who somehow discovered the entrance, who navigated the deliberately confusing upper passages, who managed to overcome the first line of defense, would find himself standing before a wall of solid stone with no mechanism available to him to open it. He could not dig around it easily. The walls of tuff on either side would require tools and time. He could not break through it. The stone was too thick and too well fitted to its niche. He could wait, but waiting meant remaining in a narrow, dark underground corridor with limited supplies, under conditions that heavily favored the defenders. In most cases, the rational response for an attacker confronted with a rolling stone door was simply to abandon the attempt. But the rolling stone doors, effective as they were, represent only one component of a defensive system that was designed with considerable depth, both literally and figuratively. The passages of Derinkuyu are deliberately difficult to navigate for anyone who does not know them. They twist, they narrow unexpectedly. They slope upward and downward in ways that confuse orientation. Some passages have low ceilings that force anyone moving through them to crouch or even crawl. A deliberate design choice that would force an attacker to move slowly, in an uncomfortable and vulnerable position, unable to swing a weapon effectively or advance in any formation. A defender thoroughly familiar with the layout of his own city, moving through the same passage with confidence and knowledge, would have an overwhelming tactical advantage over anyone who entered the system without preparation. The entrances themselves were carefully positioned and concealed. The main entrance at Derinkuyu was not, and is not, a grand gateway or a notable architectural feature. It was designed to look, from the surface, as much like nothing in particular as possible. This is not accident or modesty. This is defensive planning of a very sophisticated order. An army marching across the Cappadocian plateau looking for the underground settlement they knew existed somewhere beneath the surface villages would find, if they were lucky, only a small and apparently unremarkable doorway that looked very much like 100 other doorways they had already passed without investigation. The ventilation system, which we touched on briefly in the previous chapter, was equally sophisticated in its design. Derinkuyu contains a main ventilation shaft that descends through all levels of the complex, a vertical column of approximately 55 meters in depth and approximately 50 centimeters in diameter, connecting the deepest habitable level to a point near the surface. This shaft served multiple purposes simultaneously. It carried fresh air downward through convective circulation, ensuring that even the deepest levels of the city received enough oxygen to sustain human habitation. It carried smoke and cooking vapors upward and out. And it served, in some configurations, as an emergency water source. The shaft could be connected to underground water channels in ways that allowed water to be drawn from depth without requiring access to the surface. The ventilation shafts. There were multiple secondary shafts throughout the complex in addition to the main one, were positioned and sized with care. They were narrow enough to prevent any person from using them as an entry or exit route, but wide enough to maintain adequate airflow for the population below. Their surface openings were typically concealed or protected in ways that prevented them from being easily identified from above. An attacking force that found and blocked the ventilation shafts could in theory suffocate the population below. And the designers of Derinkuyu understood this vulnerability and addressed it as thoroughly as the technology of their time allowed. Water supply was perhaps the most critical engineering challenge of the entire enterprise, and the solution developed at Derinkuyu reflects the same careful, multi-layered thinking evident in every other aspect of its design. The complex sits above a water table that can be reached by wells dug to the appropriate depth, and numerous such wells exist throughout the city, some of them originating at the surface and descending through all levels of the complex. Others beginning at intermediate depths and reaching only to the water table. The wells that originate at the surface are fitted with the blocking mechanisms mentioned earlier, stone plugs that can seal the well at any level to prevent contamination from above. A surface force that discovered a well entrance and attempted to poison the water supply below would find themselves blocked by the internal seals before the poison could reach the inhabited levels. Water channels, some carved directly into the tuff, others lined with fired clay pipes, distribute water from the wells to various points throughout the complex. The engineering required to maintain consistent water supply at multiple levels of an 80-meter deep underground settlement, using only gravity, simple channels, and ceramic pipes, represents a level of hydraulic thinking that deserves considerable respect. Food storage, as mentioned in the previous chapter, was a central concern. And the evidence suggests that the inhabitants of Derinkuyu maintained reserves sufficient to sustain the population for extended periods. Estimates by archaeologists studying the storage capacity of the complex suggest that thousands of people could have been provisioned for several months without requiring any resupply from the surface. The combination of cool temperatures and low humidity created by the underground environment made this kind of long-term storage practical in a way that would not have been possible at surface temperatures in the same climate. Animals were also kept underground during periods of occupation. This is documented both through archaeological evidence. Areas of the complex show floor conditions consistent with animal pen use, and certain passages are wide enough for livestock to be moved through them and through the general logic of the situation. Livestock represented not just food, but capital, labor capacity, and community wealth. Leaving them on the surface during a period of hostile occupation would mean losing them permanently. Bringing them underground was difficult and complicated the practical management of the city considerably, but it preserved assets that the community could not afford to surrender. There is a tendency, when reading about all of these features, the rolling stone doors, the ventilation shafts, the sealed wells, the concealed entrances, the deliberate disorientation of the passages, to feel something approaching admiration for the designers of Derinkuyu, mixed with something approaching sadness. Because every one of these features is a response to a specific kind of threat. The rolling stone doors exist because armies forced their way into the upper levels. The concealed entrances exist because hostile forces searched the surface systematically. The sealed wells exist because someone, somewhere, attempted to poison the water supply of a community sheltering underground. These were not theoretical precautions. They were engineering responses to real experiences, to real violence, to the accumulated lessons of a community that had survived underground not once, but many times, and had learned, through bitter experience, exactly what it needed to keep its people safe. This is not a story of paranoia. It is a story of wisdom, hard, patient, expensive, practical wisdom, built in stone and preserved for 15 centuries beneath the quiet hills of Cappadocia. It is easy when thinking about Derinkuyu to focus almost entirely on its defensive features, the stone doors and the sealed wells and the concealed entrances, because those features are dramatic and because they speak directly to the most urgent question about the place, which is how it kept people alive. But defense, however well engineered, is not life, and the people who descended into these tunnels were not simply surviving. They were living, cooking and praying, and raising children and arguing and celebrating and grieving, and doing all the 10,000 ordinary things that constitute a human existence, carried out in the cool, lamplit darkness of the earth. Let us try to imagine what that daily life actually looked like. The first thing to understand is the light. The underground city of Derinkuyu had no natural light below the first level or two, where shafts and doorways near the surface might allow some ambient illumination to filter downward. Below that, everything was illuminated by oil lamps, small clay vessels filled with olive oil, fitted with a wick of twisted plant fiber, producing a flame roughly equivalent in brightness to a single candle. These lamps were placed in the niches carved into the walls for precisely this purpose, set at regular intervals along the corridors, clustered in groups in the living spaces, positioned near work areas and cooking stations and the entrances to key passages. The light they produced was warm and steady, not bright but sufficient at least, for the tasks that needed to be performed. The niches for oil lamps appear throughout Derinkuyu with remarkable consistency and care. They were not carved as afterthoughts. They were integral to the design of the spaces, positioned at heights and intervals that reflect deliberate planning for adequate illumination. The ceiling height in many of the inhabited spaces is just enough to allow a person of average height to stand comfortably. And the lamp niches are typically positioned at roughly head height or slightly above, the ideal position for a lamp that needs to illuminate both horizontal work surfaces and vertical movement through a space. Consider what it meant to live by oil lamp exclusively. Your day would not begin with sunrise because there was no sunrise. It would begin when the community decided it had begun, when the first lamps were lit, when the sounds of movement and preparation began to travel through the corridors. Time underground would have been tracked by whatever means the community had available, the movement of people, the schedule of tasks, possibly the distant sounds of the world, above filtering down through ventilation shafts. The faint warmth of daytime air that might have been perceptible in the upper levels during summer months. Cooking took place in areas that were specifically positioned in relation to the ventilation system. The kitchens of Derinkuyu, identifiable by the evidence of fire, by the arrangement of surfaces, by their proximity to ventilation shafts, were not individual household spaces in the way that modern kitchens are. They were communal facilities, large enough to prepare food for significant numbers of people simultaneously, managed by whoever in the community had that particular role. The logistics of feeding thousands of people underground, using open flames, in a space where ventilation is a carefully managed engineering system rather than a natural phenomenon, required a level of communal organization that we might find unfamiliar, but that was clearly achievable because the community achieved it. The food itself would have been the preserved supplies brought from the surface before the descent: grains, dried legumes, preserved vegetables and fruits, dried or salted meats, olive oil. Bread could be baked in underground ovens if the ventilation permitted, and there is some evidence that this occurred. Wine and other fermented beverages, produced from the stores of grapes and grain available in the storage areas, would have been part of the diet. The nutritional and caloric adequacy of this diet over extended periods is an interesting question. Certainly, it would have been less varied and less fresh than the surface diet the community was accustomed to, but it was carefully planned to be sufficient. Children lived here. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The image of children running through these carved stone corridors, playing in the lamplight, sleeping in small rooms carved from the living rock, growing up with the cool mineral smell of tuff as their most familiar scent. How did parents explain to young children why they were underground? How did children understand the difference between the surface world, which they might see only briefly and rarely during an extended period of occupation, and the underground world that was their daily reality? The archaeology cannot answer these questions directly, but the physical evidence of the spaces, the scale of certain rooms, the positioning of certain features, is entirely consistent with the presence of children and families. And the historical record of the communities that used Derinkuyu makes their presence essentially certain. Animals occupied certain sections of the complex during periods of extended occupation. The passages and rooms designated for livestock are identifiable by their slightly larger dimensions, wide enough for a donkey or a small cow to be led through without difficulty, and by the evidence in their floors. Keeping livestock underground for extended periods created significant practical challenges. The animals needed to be fed from the stored supplies, their waste needed to be managed, and the noise and smell they produced had to be accommodated within the already complex logistical environment of the underground city. That the community managed all of this is clear from the evidence. How they managed it in detail is a question for ongoing research. The social organization that would have governed underground life deserves consideration. The physical layout of Derinkuyu, with its distinct levels, its clustering of smaller rooms around larger communal spaces, its designated areas for different activities, suggests a community that maintained recognizable social structures underground. Decisions about resource allocation, about the management of communal facilities, about relations between different family groups or clans, all of these would have required some form of governance, some recognized authority structure that could function effectively in conditions of extreme stress and confinement. The Byzantine communities that used Derinkuyu most extensively during the first millennium of the Common Era would have brought with them the social structures of their surface villages, extended family networks, community elders, religious leadership in the form of priests and deacons, craft specialists and farmers and merchants whose skills and social roles remained relevant even in the underground context. The church, which we will explore in the next chapter, would have been a central organizing institution in the underground community's life, providing not just spiritual sustenance, but a framework of ritual and calendar and community identity that would have been more important than ever in conditions of darkness and confinement and fear. There is something profound in the persistence of ordinary life under these extraordinary conditions. Human beings, faced with circumstances that seem designed to reduce everything to bare survival, consistently find ways to maintain the social textures and everyday rituals that make survival meaningful rather than merely mechanical. They cook and share food. They maintain their religious practices. They tell stories to their children. They argue about small things. They celebrate when there is anything to celebrate. They grieve their dead. They fall in love, presumably. They go on. The cool, still air of Derinkuyu carries no echo of voices. The lamp niches in its walls are empty now, their clay vessels long since removed or crumbled to dust. The floors are worn smooth by footsteps that were made by people who have been gone for centuries. And yet standing in these spaces, in the gentle darkness, in the steady underground temperature, in the absolute quiet that belongs to the world beneath the world, you feel the presence of those people with remarkable clarity. Not as ghosts or abstractions, but as recognizable human beings who faced extraordinary circumstances with extraordinary resourcefulness and ordinary courage. They were afraid. Of course they were afraid. The fear is built into the very architecture of the place. But they were also persistent, organized, creative, and deeply, tenaciously committed to the continuation of their community. And for the centuries during which they needed it, this underground world, cool and dark and carved from the living earth, kept them alive. There is a room in Derinkuyu that is different from all the others. You reach it by descending through several levels, passing the storage areas and the communal kitchens and the residential quarters, following a passage that widens slightly as it curves through the rock in a long, deliberate arc. The ceiling here is higher than in the surrounding corridors, not dramatically so, but enough to produce a perceptible change in the feeling of the space, a slight release of the closeness that characterizes the functional areas of the complex. The walls on either side have been worked with more care than is strictly necessary for structural purposes, smoothed to a finer finish, shaped with an attention to proportion that speaks of something beyond utility. And at the far end, cut directly into the living rock, there is an apse, a semicircular recess, precisely the shape that appears at the eastern end of every Byzantine church ever built, from the grandest cathedral in Constantinople to the humblest village chapel on the Anatolian plateau. This is the underground church of Derinkuyu, and its presence here at depth in darkness. Carved from volcanic tuff, with the same careful hands that carved the storerooms and the animal pens and the rolling stone niches. Its presence here tells us something essential about the people who built this city and about the world they were trying to preserve. To understand the church, you need to understand something about early Christianity in Cappadocia, because the story of faith in this region is one of the most remarkable and consequential in the entire history of the Christian tradition. Cappadocia was, by the early centuries of the Common Era, a deeply significant center of Christian thought and practice. The region produced several of the most important theologians of the early church, figures whose intellectual and spiritual contributions shaped the development of Christian doctrine in ways that echo clearly even today. Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa. And Gregory, the theologian, collectively known to historians and theologians as the Cappadocian Fathers, were all born and formed in this landscape during the 4th century of the Common Era, and their theological work, conducted against the backdrop of these pale volcanic hills and extraordinary carved landscapes, became foundational to the development of Christian thought across both the Eastern and Western traditions. But the Christianity of Cappadocia was not only theological and intellectual. It was also practical and communal, rooted in village life, in the rhythms of agriculture and seasonal migration, in the particular social textures of a plateau community living between multiple empires and multiple cultural currents. And it was, at various points in its history, a persecuted faith, not continuously and not uniformly, but with enough regularity and enough severity to make the question of physical refuge genuinely urgent. The earliest Christian communities in Cappadocia faced periodic persecution under Roman authority during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. The Edict of Milan in 313, issued by Constantine and Licinius, formally granted tolerance to Christianity throughout the Roman Empire and ended the era of official Roman persecution. But the relief that followed was not permanent, and the centuries that came after introduced new forms of threat that were, for the Christian communities of Cappadocia, equally compelling reasons to maintain and expand their underground refuges. The Arab raids that swept across Anatolia beginning in the 7th century, following the rapid and dramatic expansion of the early Islamic Caliphate, brought a new and immediate form of danger to the surface communities of Cappadocia. These raids were not conducted by a centralized occupation force maintaining stable control of the region. They were periodic, fast-moving military incursions that could descend on a village with little warning, plunder its resources, and withdraw before any Byzantine military response could be organized. For a surface village with no defensive walls and no military garrison, the options during such a raid were essentially 3: flee, surrender, or hide. Of these, hiding underground in a space that could not easily be discovered or breached, was by far the most effective, provided that the underground space was ready and provisioned when the warning came. The Byzantine period of Cappadocian history, broadly spanning from the 4th through the 11th centuries of the Common Era, is the period most strongly associated with the intensive use and expansion of Derinkuyu and the other underground complexes of the region. The Byzantine Empire, the successor state to the Eastern Roman Empire, maintained Cappadocia as an important provincial territory, and the Christian communities of the region existed within the broader Byzantine cultural and religious framework, while also maintaining the specific local traditions and physical adaptations that the landscape and its history had produced. The underground church at Derinkuyu reflects this Byzantine context precisely. Its apse faces east, the standard orientation of Byzantine church architecture, aligned toward Jerusalem and toward the rising sun, which carried layered symbolic significance in Christian liturgical tradition. The space is large enough to accommodate a congregation of reasonable size, not the entire population of the underground city simultaneously, but a significant gathering, sufficient for communal worship to take place in a recognizable and meaningful way. There is evidence of what may have been a baptismal font, a cruciform pool cut into the rock floor, its dimensions consistent with the immersion baptism practiced in the Byzantine rite. There are niches that would have held sacred objects or lamps or both. And there is, running through the entire space, the same careful workmanship that distinguishes it from the purely functional areas of the complex, a quality of attention that speaks of the importance attached to this particular room by the people who carved it and used it. To worship underground, in darkness, by lamplight, while the surface world above you was occupied by a hostile force, requires a particular quality of faith, not faith in the abstract or theoretical sense, but faith as a lived and embodied practice, faith as the thing that makes it possible to gather in a carved stone room 80 meters below the surface and sing and pray and receive the Eucharist and feel that the community gathered in that darkness is still. In spite of everything, the community that God has kept alive. The underground church was not a compromise or a diminishment of the community's religious life. It was an expression of that life under conditions that made its continuation more urgent and more meaningful than ever. It is worth noting that Cappadocia is extraordinary not just for its underground religious spaces, but for the entire landscape of carved and painted churches that characterizes the region. The famous rock-cut churches of the Gurim Valley, now protected as part of the Gurim National Park, and the rock sites of Cappadocia, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1985, contain some of the finest examples of Byzantine fresco painting in the entire world. These surface churches, carved into the fairy chimneys and cliff faces of the valley, are decorated with elaborate iconographic programs, scenes from the life of Christ, images of saints and martyrs and archangels, portraits of donors and patrons whose names and faces survive in paint on the carved stone walls of churches that have not been used for regular worship in many centuries. The underground churches of Derinkuyu contain no surviving frescoes. The conditions of underground habitation, the movement of people and animals, and smoke through these spaces over centuries of use have not been kind to any painted decoration that might once have existed. But the physical forms of the spaces, the apse, the nave proportions, the placement of liturgical furniture, tell their own clear story about the importance of organized Christian worship to the community that built and used them. Consider also what the underground church represented in terms of the community's sense of identity and continuity. Bringing the church underground, not just the practice of private prayer, but the entire apparatus of communal worship, with its altar and its liturgical vessels and its gathered congregation and its ordained priest, was an act of cultural preservation as much as religious devotion. It was a statement made in carved stone and maintained across generations that this community intended to survive not just physically but spiritually and culturally, that the things that made them who they were, their faith, their liturgical calendar, their communal rituals of birth and death and marriage and initiation, would continue underground exactly as they had continued above ground and would still be intact and functioning when the danger had passed and the community ascended again to the surface. Faith in Derinkuyu was not separate from survival. It was integral to it, not in a naive or simplistic sense, but in the deep practical sense that a community which maintains its identity and its shared meaning under extreme pressure is a community that can endure those pressures long enough to emerge from them. The underground church was part of the infrastructure of survival just as surely as the rolling stone doors and the sealed wells, and its presence here, at depth, in the cool and lamplit darkness of the carved tuff, tells us something important about what survival actually requires. It requires more than food and water and shelter. It requires meaning. And in Derinkuyu, meaning was carved from the same stone as everything else, patiently, deliberately, with great care and considerable skill, in the darkness beneath the open sky. Derinkuyu did not stand alone. This is perhaps the most astonishing aspect of the underground landscape of Cappadocia, and it is one that tends to recede somewhat in the popular imagination, which focuses understandably on Derinkuyu as the largest and most accessible of the region's underground complexes. But the reality of what lies beneath this plateau is considerably more extensive and more interconnected than any single site can convey. A network of underground settlements, passages, and connecting tunnels that spreads across the region in a pattern that archaeologists and geologists are still working to fully understand and document. The most significant of Derinkuyu's neighboring underground cities is Kaymakli, located approximately 9 kilometers to the north. Kaymakli was formally rediscovered and opened to archaeological investigation in 1964, 1 year after Derinkuyu's modern rediscovery, which we will discuss in detail in a later chapter, and it has since been surveyed and partially opened to visitors. Like Derinkuyu, Kaymakli is a multi-level underground complex carved from Cappadocian tuff, containing storage areas, living quarters, stables, a winery, a church, and the various engineering features, ventilation shafts, rolling stone doors, sealed water systems that characterize this type of settlement. It is generally considered to extend to approximately 4 levels in its currently surveyed form, though as with Derinkuyu, portions of the complex remain inaccessible and incompletely mapped. What makes the relationship between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli particularly remarkable, and what moves the story from the account of 2 adjacent archaeological sites to something considerably more extraordinary, is the documented existence of a tunnel connecting them. A passage running beneath the open landscape of the Cappadocian Plateau, linking 2 major underground cities separated by 9 kilometers of distance. This tunnel has been identified and partially traced by archaeological survey, though it has not been fully mapped or made accessible to visitors. The condition of portions of the passage, partially collapsed in places, structurally uncertain in others, means that comprehensive exploration requires both engineering assessment and careful conservation planning that is ongoing. 9 kilometers is a significant distance underground. The engineering implications alone, the maintenance of consistent structural integrity through nearly 9 kilometers of carved tuff, the management of ventilation and water over that distance, the logistical challenge of moving people and supplies through such a passage, are substantial. But the strategic logic of such a connection is equally clear. 2 communities sheltering in separate underground cities, linked by a passage that allowed movement between them without exposure to the surface, would have been far more resilient than two isolated settlements. Supplies could be shared. People could be moved to whichever settlement had more space or more resources. Communication between communities could be maintained during periods of surface occupation without any member of either community having to risk exposure. Whether this tunnel was regularly used for such purposes or whether it served primarily as an emergency option is not definitively established by the current archaeological evidence. What is established is that it exists, that someone at some point undertook the extraordinary work of connecting two major underground cities with a passage of this length, and that the decision to do so reflects a level of regional coordination and long-term planning that goes well beyond the immediate needs of a single community. Kaymakli and Derinkuyu are the two largest and most extensively surveyed of the Cappadocian underground cities, but they are far from the only ones. The region contains dozens of underground settlements of varying sizes and complexities, some large enough to have housed hundreds of people, others small enough to represent the refuge of a single extended family or village community. Erzkanak. Located approximately 14 kilometers north of Avanos in the northern part of the Cappadocian region, is another formally identified and partially surveyed underground settlement. Notable for some distinctive engineering features that differ in detail from those of Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, including a somewhat different approach to the management of ventilation, and what appears to be a more elaborate system of communication holes connecting different sections of the complex. The settlement at Erzkanak was brought to the attention of archaeologists in 1972 by a local farmer named Latif Akar, who discovered it while investigating why the water he used to irrigate his wheat field seemed to be disappearing into the ground. This discovery, made not by a professional archaeologist, but by a working farmer noticing something unusual in the behavior of his land, is in many ways typical of how underground settlements in Cappadocia have come to light over the past several decades. The landscape above these settlements gives very little indication of what lies beneath it. The discovery process tends to be accidental, incremental, and dependent on the curiosity and observational attention of local people who know their land intimately. There are, according to various archaeological surveys and assessments of the region, somewhere between 200 and 600 underground settlements of various sizes scattered across the Cappadocian Plateau, though the precise count depends significantly on what minimum size or complexity qualifies a carved underground space as a distinct settlement rather than a simple cellar or storage room. Of these, only a relatively small number have been systematically surveyed, and an even smaller number have been made accessible to visitors. The vast majority remain beneath the landscape, beneath modern villages, beneath agricultural fields, beneath roads and houses and orchards, known primarily from surface survey and occasional accidental discovery, awaiting the time and resources for more comprehensive investigation. The implications of this distributed underground landscape are significant. This was not a single community making a single decision to go underground in a particular location. This was a regional response, sustained over centuries, practiced across dozens of communities, coordinated to a degree that may have been far more extensive than the currently available evidence allows us to fully appreciate. The underground landscape of Cappadocia represents, in this broader view, one of the most extensive and most sophisticated systems of civilian refuge ever created in the ancient world. The question of who coordinated this regional effort, whether there was any central authority directing the construction and maintenance of the tunnel network, or whether individual communities made independent decisions that happened to produce compatible and occasionally connected results, is one that archaeologists approach with appropriate caution. The Byzantine administrative structure of the region would have provided some degree of coordination capacity, and the Orthodox Christian Church, as a regional institution with consistent authority across multiple communities, would have been another potential source of coordination. But the evidence for the specific central direction of the underground building program is not clearly established, and the conservative interpretation is that much of what was built reflects the cumulative decisions of individual communities responding to shared circumstances. The surveys that have been conducted in Cappadocia over the past several decades have been carried out by a combination of Turkish government archaeologists, university research teams, and international collaborators working within the framework of Turkish cultural heritage law. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey technologies have been increasingly deployed to map underground structures without the need for excavation, and the results of these surveys have consistently suggested that the known extent of the underground network is considerably smaller than its actual extent. There is more down there. Considerably more. The mapping process is ongoing, and each year of survey adds new data to a picture that grows more remarkable the more of it becomes visible. Somewhere beneath the quiet surface of Cappadocia, beneath the fairy chimneys and the vineyards, and the small stone houses of villages that have stood for centuries, there are corridors and chambers and stairways and wells that have not been entered by a living person in perhaps 1,000 years. The air in those spaces has not moved. The stone of their walls has not been touched. Whatever they contain, whatever the people who last used them left behind when they ascended for the final time, remains exactly as it was, patient, still, waiting in the cool and absolute darkness for the light and attention that may eventually reach them. Any place that has been as significant to as many people over as long a period as Derinkuyu will inevitably accumulate stories, not the careful, evidence-based accounts of archaeologists and historians, but something older and looser and more imaginative, the folklore of a landscape, the stories that communities tell about the remarkable things that surround them, shaped by the specific character of the place and the particular needs of the people doing the telling. The underground spaces of Cappadocia have generated a rich tradition of local legend, and it is worth spending time with that tradition. Not because the legends are historically accurate in the way that archaeological evidence is accurate, but because they tell us something genuine about how communities relate to remarkable features of their landscape, and because they contain sometimes grains of specific information that reward careful attention, even when the narrative frame around them is clearly folkloric. The most widespread category of legend associated with the underground tunnels of Cappadocia concerns their extent and their connectivity. Local tradition in the villages above Derinkuyu and Kaymakli has long held that the tunnels extend far further than any modern survey has confirmed, that passages run not merely between the known major sites, but beneath the entire plateau in a vast subterranean network. That tunnels connect villages separated by distances that would make their underground connection an extraordinary engineering achievement, that somewhere in the deeper and uncharted portions of the system, there are spaces of remarkable size that have never been found by modern investigators. Some of these claims cannot be simply dismissed, because some of what local tradition described as existing underground has subsequently been confirmed by archaeological survey. The connecting tunnel between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, for example, was described in local oral tradition before its existence was formally documented by archaeologists, an instance of local knowledge preserving accurate information about a real feature of the underground landscape across a span of time during which no one was actively surveying it. This is not unusual in the archaeology of inhabited landscapes. Communities often retain accurate knowledge about features of their local environment in forms that look like legend or folklore until the evidence catches up with the story. But it is equally important to be clear about what the legends do not establish. They do not establish the existence of deeper levels at Derinkuyu beyond those that have been surveyed. They do not confirm the presence of chambers filled with historical artifacts waiting to be discovered. They do not support the existence of tunnels connecting Cappadocia to distant regions of Turkey or beyond. The evidence for such claims does not exist, and responsible engagement with the folklore of this region requires maintaining the distinction between what local tradition says and what the physical evidence actually demonstrates. One category of legend that appears repeatedly in accounts of the Cappadocian underground concerns the experience of individuals who entered the tunnels and became lost, or who heard sounds within the tunnels that could not be immediately explained. The acoustic properties of underground carved spaces are genuinely remarkable. Sounds travel through tuff in ways that can be surprising and disorienting, carrying voices and footsteps around corners and through walls in a manner that makes it difficult to identify the direction or distance of the source. For communities that used these tunnels regularly and knew them intimately, this acoustic behavior would have been familiar and unremarkable. For an outsider entering the system without knowledge of its layout or its acoustic properties, the experience could easily produce the impression of sounds without visible sources, of voices in empty corridors, of footsteps following in passages that appear unoccupied. The legend of the whispering tunnels, the idea that the passages of Derinkuyu carry voices of the people who once inhabited them. That if you listen carefully in the deepest and most silent sections of the complex, you can hear something that might be the echo of a prayer or a conversation from 1,000 years ago, is not, of course, literally true. Stone does not retain and replay acoustic information in that way. But the legend reflects something real about the experience of being in these spaces, the way that the absolute silence of the deep underground amplifies whatever small sounds do occur. The way that the physical evidence of past habitation everywhere in these corridors creates an almost tangible sense of presence, the way that imagination in conditions of darkness and stillness reaches instinctively toward narrative and meaning. There are also legends associated specifically with the rolling stone doors, stories of doors that rolled shut on their own, trapping people within the sealed sections, or stories of doors that could not be opened from the inside even by those who knew how to operate them, suggesting that something within the mechanism had failed or been deliberately sabotaged. These legends reflect a genuine anxiety about the most dramatic engineering feature of the underground city, the anxiety that the mechanism designed to protect you might also, under some circumstances, become the thing that traps you. This is not an irrational fear. The rolling stone doors were, by design, very difficult to open from the wrong side, and any malfunction of the operating mechanism on the interior would have created a serious problem for anyone caught in a sealed section. Whether any such incidents actually occurred, whether anyone was ever trapped by a malfunctioning stone door in the long history of Derinkuyu's use, is not established by the historical or archaeological record. The legend exists, the evidence does not. This distinction matters, and it is one that the folklore of the underground consistently invites us to maintain. Treasure legends are another category that appears reliably in the oral tradition of Cappadocia. Stories describe chambers deep within the tunnel systems, always deeper than any current survey has reached, always in sections that are currently inaccessible, filled with the accumulated wealth of the communities that sheltered here. Gold coins, sacred objects, manuscripts, precious metals. The specific contents vary with the telling, but the core idea is consistent, that in their final descent underground the communities of Derinkuyu brought with them everything of value they possessed, and that some portion of that wealth was never retrieved when they returned to the surface. This legend is not entirely implausible in its general premise. Communities descending underground in the face of an advancing hostile force would certainly have brought their most valuable portable possessions with them. Sacred objects, liturgical vessels, icons, relics would have been among the highest priority items for a Byzantine Christian community. Documents of legal or financial importance would have been brought. Coin and jewelry would have been taken rather than left for raiding forces. Whether any such items remain underground, inaccessible sections that were simply overlooked during archaeological survey, or in inaccessible sections that have not yet been examined, is genuinely unknown. Archaeological survey of the accessible portions of Derinkuyu has not produced dramatic finds of this kind, but the inaccessible portions have not been systematically examined. What the treasure legends capture beneath their surface narrative of hidden wealth. Is something true about the history of the underground city? The idea that the communities who used it brought with them the things that mattered most. That they carried their identity and their wealth and their faith underground just as they carried their bodies and their children and their livestock, and that the underground city was therefore not merely a physical shelter, but a repository of everything the community valued about itself. In that sense, even if no literal treasure chest awaits discovery in a sealed lower chamber, the legend points toward a real truth, that Derinkuyu contains within its carved walls the accumulated investment of generations, not gold necessarily, but time and skill, and communal effort and faith, deposited in stone across centuries of use and expansion. There is one local tradition worth noting separately, not because it constitutes historical evidence, but because it reflects a specific and affecting way of understanding the relationship between the underground city and the communities above it. In some versions of the local oral tradition, Derinkuyu is described not as a place of fear or refuge, but as a second home, a familiar place, known since childhood, visited regularly for storage and preparation even in peacetime, as comfortable and habitual as the surface village itself. In this telling, the descent underground was not experienced primarily as an act of desperation, but as a practiced and familiar response. Almost routine in its execution, the community moving underground with the efficiency of people who had done it many times before and who knew exactly where everything was and how everything worked. Whether this reflects an accurate memory of how the community actually experienced periods of underground occupation, or whether it represents a kind of retrospective softening of what must have been a genuinely frightening and difficult experience, is impossible to say with certainty. But there is something in this version of the tradition that feels consistent with what the archaeological evidence suggests. A community that used this space with such regularity and such thoroughness that it became genuinely habitual, a place of safety rather than simply a place of fear. A second home, built from the inside of the earth, maintained across generations and passed down as part of the community's most essential inheritance. That is a story worth telling carefully, and it is, perhaps, the truest legend of all. There is a particular kind of admiration that comes from studying the engineering of the ancient world, not the breathless, uncritical admiration that imagines impossible technologies or supernatural assistance, but something quieter and more considered. The admiration of recognizing, in the work of people who lived centuries or millennia before us, a quality of thinking that is entirely familiar, logical, systematic, problem-solving in its orientation, expressed through the materials and methods available to them with a sophistication that rewards careful attention. Derinkuyu rewards that attention very generously. We have already discussed several of the most immediately striking engineering features of the underground city: the rolling stone doors, the concealed entrances, the sealed wells, the ventilation shafts, in the context of survival and defense. But the engineering of Derinkuyu is deeper and more comprehensive than any single feature or category of features, and to appreciate it fully you need to consider the system as a whole, the way its individual components interact and support each other, the way problems were identified and solutions developed and refined across multiple generations of use and expansion. Begin with the question of air. An underground space sealed from the surface is, in the simplest terms, a space with a finite supply of oxygen. A single person in a sealed room of moderate size can survive for several hours before the oxygen concentration falls to dangerous levels. A population of thousands of people in an underground city, with all the oxygen demands of cooking fires and oil lamps in addition to human respiration, faces an air management challenge of genuinely formidable complexity. The fact that Derinkuyu demonstrably sustained large populations underground for extended periods, weeks or months at a time, across multiple historical episodes, means that this challenge was successfully met. The question is how. The primary mechanism, as noted earlier, is the main ventilation shaft, a vertical column approximately 55 meters deep, connecting the lowest inhabited level to a point near the surface. This shaft functions through the principle of convective air circulation. Warm air, heated by the body heat of the population and the cooking fires and the oil lamps, rises through the shaft and exits at the surface, drawing cooler, fresher air downward through secondary shafts and any other available openings. This is a passive system. It requires no mechanical assistance, no pumps or bellows, no ongoing human management beyond keeping the shafts clear of obstruction. It works continuously and automatically, as long as the temperature differential between the underground air and the surface air maintains the convective circulation. The underground temperature of Derinkuyu is consistently around 13 to 15 degrees Celsius throughout the year, significantly cooler than the surface in summer, when temperatures on the Cappadocian Plateau can reach 35 degrees or more, and somewhat warmer than the surface in winter. In summer, when the population was most likely to be sheltering underground, the Arab raids that drove the most intensive use of the system were typically seasonal, occurring in the warmer months when military movement was more practical. This temperature differential strongly favored the convective circulation of air. Warm surface air is less dense than the cooler underground air, which means the natural tendency of air in this system is to move downward through the shafts from the surface, ensuring a steady flow of fresh air into the inhabited levels. The positioning of the ventilation shafts throughout the complex reflects a sophisticated understanding of how airflow works in an enclosed underground system. Secondary shafts are distributed at intervals that ensure no section of the inhabited complex is too distant from a fresh air source. The kitchens and other areas that produce smoke and combustion products are positioned in a specific relationship to the shaft system, so that their output is directed efficiently upward and out rather than into the living areas. The shafts themselves are angled and positioned to maximize airflow while minimizing the risk of their surface openings being easily identified and blocked by hostile forces. The structural engineering of the complex is equally thoughtful. Tuff, as a construction material, has excellent compressive strength. It can support very large loads without crushing, but relatively limited tensile strength, meaning that horizontal spans of unsupported tuff above a room can eventually crack and fail if they are too wide. The builders of Derinkuyu managed this constraint through careful control of room dimensions and ceiling geometry. The arched ceiling profile that appears throughout the complex, particularly in the larger rooms, is not merely aesthetic. It is a structural solution that distributes the compressive forces from the rock above along the curved surface of the arch, rather than concentrating them at the midpoint of a flat span, significantly increasing the load that the ceiling can safely carry. Columns and piers of unexcavated tuff are left in strategic positions throughout the complex, providing additional support for the rock above while being incorporated into the design of the spaces in ways that do not significantly impede their use. In some areas of Derinkuyu, what appear at first to be decorative elements of the carved architecture, rounded protrusions from the walls, stepped profiles at the junctions of walls and ceilings, are in fact structural features left deliberately to maintain the integrity of the surrounding rock during and after excavation. The drainage and waste management systems of the complex, while less dramatic than the ventilation or defensive engineering, represent an equally important component of the overall design. Underground spaces without adequate drainage quickly become uninhabitable, water pooling on floors, moisture accumulating in walls, waste accumulating without means of removal. The drainage channels cut into the floors of the kitchen areas and the animal sections of Derinkuyu are part of a system that directed liquid waste towards specific collection and disposal points, preventing the accumulation of standing water and the associated problems of moisture damage and sanitation. The management of human and animal waste in an underground city housing thousands of people over extended periods is a logistical challenge that deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of Derinkuyu. The physical evidence of how this was managed in detail is not fully preserved in the archaeological record. But the spatial organization of the complex, with certain areas clearly designated for activities that produce waste and positioned in specific relationship to drainage systems and ventilation, suggests that the community had developed workable solutions. The alternative, an underground population of thousands without functioning sanitation, would have produced disease conditions that would have negated all the other protective features of the city within a relatively short period, and the demonstrated long-term habitability of the complex argues strongly against this outcome. The wells of Derinkuyu, considered as engineering rather than simply as water sources, are remarkable for the precision of their construction. Vertical shafts of consistent diameter, maintaining their alignment through 80 meters of varying tough geology, fitted with stone plugs at multiple levels that seat precisely enough to prevent contaminated water from passing the seal. This is careful, skilled work, produced without modern surveying instruments or drilling equipment. The tools available to the excavators of Derinkuyu were simple iron implements, picks, chisels, wedges, and yet the precision of the well shafts suggests a level of skill in their use that speaks of extensive experience and refined technique. There is a broader point to be made here about the relationship between apparent technological simplicity and actual engineering sophistication. Derinkuyu was built with tools that any modern person would consider rudimentary. There were no steam engines, no electricity, no reinforced concrete, no computer modeling of structural loads or airflow dynamics. And yet the system that was built with those simple tools solved successfully and durably an extraordinary range of complex engineering problems. Ventilation, water, supply, drainage, structural stability, defensive permeability. Concealment in ways that reflect a depth of understanding and a quality of reasoning that has nothing primitive about it. The engineering of Derinkuyu is the engineering of people who thought carefully about a difficult problem, who had the patience to test their solutions over time and to refine them across generations, and who ultimately produced something that worked, that kept thousands of people alive repeatedly across centuries of use. That is a considerable achievement by any standard, and it deserves to be recognized as such, without either romanticization or condescension. Professor Ömer Özkan, among other Turkish archaeologists and geologists who have worked in the region, has noted in surveys of the underground complex that certain structural features of Derinkuyu demonstrate what appears to be a progressive refinement of technique across different phases of excavation. Later sections showing a somewhat greater sophistication in ceiling geometry and wall finishing than earlier ones, suggesting that the accumulated knowledge of the building community improved over time in a way that is consistent with a long-term, multi-generational building program. This kind of incremental technical improvement, documented in stone, is one of the clearest indicators of how genuinely thoughtful the engineering of this place was, not a single inspired design implemented all at once, but a living system that grew more refined with each generation that contributed to it. The engineers of Derinkuyu did not leave written records of their reasoning. They left something more durable, the reasoning itself, embedded in stone, preserved in the geometry of arched ceilings and the positioning of ventilation shafts and the precise calibration of rolling stone doors and the carefully angled channels of the drainage system. If you know how to read it, that record is eloquent beyond any written account. It speaks of intelligence and patience and problem-solving of a very high order, carried out by people whose names we do not know, working with tools we would consider inadequate, in the service of a community they loved enough to spend their lives protecting. For a long time, for several centuries, in fact, Derinkuyu was not exactly forgotten. The villages above it had always known, in a general way, that there was something beneath them. Local people used the upper levels of the complex for storage. The cool, stable underground temperature made it ideal for keeping wine and preserves and vegetables through the summer. Some families had access points to the upper tunnels through their own cellars and outbuildings, using them as a practical extension of their household storage space, without necessarily being fully aware of or interested in the extent of what lay below. The deeper levels, the rolling stone doors, the ventilation shafts descending 55 meters into the earth, these were known to some, rumored by others, and of the detailed structural complexity of the full system, very little was systematically documented. The event that changed this, the moment that brought Derinkuyu to the formal attention of archaeologists and ultimately to the awareness of the wider world, is remarkably ordinary in its circumstances. In 1963, a resident of the town of Derinkuyu was renovating his home. In the process of the renovation, working in the lower levels of his house, he broke through a wall. Behind the wall was a room he had not known was there, and behind that room was a passage, and behind that passage was another room and another passage, and another room. And as the man followed the passages deeper and deeper into the rock beneath his house, he began to understand that what he had found was something considerably larger than a simple cellar or a storage room. The discovery was reported to the Turkish Department of Culture, and a formal archaeological investigation was initiated. What that investigation revealed, the full 8-level extent of the complex, the rolling stone doors, the ventilation system, the church, the wells, was sufficient to prompt the rapid excavation and assessment of the accessible portions of the site. By 1965, Derinkuyu had been opened to visitors, a remarkably short interval between formal discovery and public access, reflecting both the significance of the find and the practical relative accessibility of the carved spaces, which required cleaning and basic safety assessment, but not the kind of extensive structural intervention that some archaeological sites demand. The 1963 discovery was not, however, the beginning of modern awareness of the underground cities of Cappadocia. Earlier travelers and scholars had noted the existence of underground spaces in the region. The German theologian and traveler Paul Lucas described underground habitations in Cappadocia in the early 18th century, and various Ottoman administrative records reference underground settlements in the region in ways that confirm their use had not entirely ceased even in the early modern period. But these earlier references did not prompt systematic archaeological investigation, and the full extent and complexity of Derinkuyu remained undocumented until the events of 1963. The formal archaeological survey that followed the discovery proceeded in stages, as resources and expertise permitted. The Turkish government, through the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, took responsibility for the site's management and conservation, and the process of clearing accumulated debris from the passages, stabilizing structurally uncertain areas, installing basic visitor infrastructure, and documenting the physical characteristics of the accessible spaces began and continued across subsequent decades. The work was careful and methodical. Archaeological practice demands this pace because the information contained in an undisturbed archaeological deposit is extraordinarily fragile and easily destroyed by hasty excavation. The designation of Derinkuyu and the broader Gurim National Park and rock sites of Cappadocia as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985 added an important layer of international recognition and protection to the ongoing conservation effort. The UNESCO designation acknowledges the outstanding universal value of the region's cultural and natural heritage, and creates a framework of international expectation around the management and preservation of that heritage. It also, importantly, supports the funding and institutional capacity required for ongoing archaeological research and conservation work, both of which are substantial undertakings in a site of this complexity and extent. The mapping of Derinkuyu has been an ongoing process, not a single survey completed at a fixed point in time, but a cumulative effort that has added progressively more detailed documentation of the complex over the decades since its formal rediscovery. Early mapping relied on traditional archaeological survey methods, direct measurement, hand-drawn plans, photographic documentation. More recent mapping efforts have incorporated ground-penetrating radar, three-dimensional laser scanning, and other non-invasive technologies that allow the documentation of features that cannot be directly accessed without risking structural damage to the surrounding rock. The results of these more recent surveys have been in some respects surprising, not because they have revealed dramatic new chambers or hidden levels, but because they have confirmed that the boundary between the known and the unknown portions of Derinkuyu is considerably less clear than it might appear from a visit to the accessible sections. Portions of the complex that appear from the accessible corridors to be solid rock have been shown by ground-penetrating radar to contain voids, unfilled spaces that may represent additional rooms, collapsed sections, or portions of the complex that were sealed or abandoned at some point in the history of its use. The relationship between modern Derinkuyu, the town that sits above the underground complex, and the archaeological site beneath it is complex and ongoing. The town has grown considerably since 1963, and the expansion of buildings and infrastructure above the underground complex creates both practical challenges for archaeological survey and conservation concerns about the potential impact of surface construction on the structural integrity of the tunnels below. Some areas of the underground city lie directly beneath occupied buildings, which complicates access for survey and limits the options for structural intervention if problems are identified. There is something genuinely affecting about the image of a modern Turkish town going about its daily business above one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. People shopping and cooking and raising families on streets that run directly above rooms where Byzantine Christians sheltered from Arab raids 1,200 years ago. Above passages that were carved by hands that have been dust for 15 centuries, above ventilation shafts that still maintain in their cool and silent depths the temperature and air quality that once kept thousands of people alive. The discovery of Derinkuyu changed permanently how we understand the underground landscape of Cappadocia, not just as a geological curiosity or a tourist attraction, but as a document of human history. A physical record of how communities respond to danger and how they maintain their identity and their values under conditions of extreme pressure. Every year that passes adds to that understanding, as survey technologies improve and archaeological methods become more refined, and the patient work of documentation and conservation continues beneath the quiet streets of a town that carries, in its very name, a reminder of what lies beneath it. Deep well. That is what Derinkuyu means, and it is, in every sense that matters, exactly right. There is an important and honest thing to say at this point in our journey through Derinkuyu and the broader underground landscape of Cappadocia, and it is this: we do not fully understand it. Not in the way that the phrase is sometimes used, not as a dramatic admission of bafflement in the face of impossible technologies or inexplicable mysteries, but in the straightforward practical sense that there is significantly more of this underground world than has been systematically surveyed. That the questions it raises are considerably more numerous than the answers currently available, and that the archaeology of the region is in the most literal sense a work in progress, whose most significant findings may lie ahead of us rather than behind. Consider the sheer numerical uncertainty involved. Estimates of the number of underground settlements in the Cappadocian region range from roughly 200 to upward of 600, depending on the methodology used and the threshold applied for what constitutes a distinct settlement. Of those, only a handful have been formally surveyed and documented in any comprehensive way. The remainder are known primarily from surface survey, the identification of features at ground level that are consistent with underground excavation below, and from the accumulated observations of local communities who have lived above them for generations. The question of the full depth of Derinkuyu itself remains genuinely open. The 8 levels currently documented represent the accessible and surveyed portions of the complex. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified anomalies at depths below the currently accessible sections, voids in the tuff that may represent additional spaces. Whether these represent additional inhabited levels, collapsed sections, incomplete excavations that were abandoned before they were fully developed, or some other feature of the underground geology is not established. Access to these potential lower sections would require structural assessment and engineering preparation that has not yet been undertaken, and the decision to undertake such work involves careful weighing of potential archaeological value against conservation risk. The connecting tunnel between Derinkuyu and Kaymakli, the 9-kilometer passage whose existence is documented but whose full extent has not been comprehensively mapped, represents perhaps the single most significant outstanding question in the archaeology of the region. The portions of this tunnel that have been traced and assessed are structurally variable, some sections in good condition, others partially collapsed or otherwise inaccessible. A comprehensive survey of the full passage from one end to the other would require a significant dedicated engineering and archaeological effort, and would need to address both the structural safety of the passage for survey teams and the conservation implications of disturbing a deposit that has been undisturbed for centuries. The academic literature on Derinkuyu and the Cappadocian underground cities continues to develop. Turkish archaeologists working through universities and through the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism have produced important documentation of the sites over the past several decades. International collaborative research programs have contributed additional perspectives and methodologies. The application of increasingly sophisticated non-invasive survey technologies, ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, airborne LiDAR survey, has been progressively expanding the picture of the underground landscape visible from the surface, identifying new sites and adding detail to the maps of known ones. One area of active scholarly discussion concerns the precise chronology of the different phases of Derinkuyu's construction and use. The physical characteristics of the complex suggest multiple phases of excavation, as noted earlier. But establishing absolute dates for those phases is challenging because the tuff itself does not contain datable organic material, and because the extended use of the spaces has mixed and obscured much of the stratigraphic evidence that would normally be available to date an archaeological deposit. Thermoluminescence dating of fired clay objects found in the complex and radiocarbon dating of any organic material that can be identified and sampled are among the techniques being applied to this chronological question, but definitive answers remain elusive. The question of the population that Derinkuyu could sustain, how many people actually sheltered here during periods of occupation, and for how long, is another area of ongoing investigation. Early estimates, sometimes cited in popular accounts, suggested figures of up to 20,000 people, but this figure has been questioned by more recent archaeological assessment, which tends toward more conservative estimates based on careful calculation of the actual inhabitable volume of the documented complex. The honest answer is that we do not know precisely, and that the true figure depends on both the actual extent of the complex, including its currently inaccessible portions, and on assumptions about how densely packed the population was during periods of emergency use. There are passages in Derinkuyu that the visitor walking through the accessible sections of the site can see entering the rock and disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the installed lighting. Passages whose destinations are not documented in the current survey, whose structural condition has not been assessed, and which therefore remain for entirely practical and sensible reasons unexplored in the formal archaeological sense. These passages are not concealed or mysterious, they are simply passages that have not yet been examined. For the same kinds of reasons that many features of many archaeological sites around the world have not yet been examined, the limitations of time resources and the careful priorities of conservation-minded archaeology. What waits at the end of those passages, whether more rooms, more levels, collapsed sections, or simply dead ends where the excavators stopped work for reasons that are now lost to time, is genuinely unknown. This is not a dramatic mystery to be solved by unconventional means. It is simply the normal condition of a large and complex archaeological site whose investigation is ongoing. The answers will come, in time, through the patient application of proper archaeological methods and appropriate technology, carried out by the researchers who have dedicated their professional lives to understanding this extraordinary place. What is perhaps most interesting about the limits of our current understanding of Derinkuyu is not any specific unknown feature, any particular unexplored passage or unconfirmed level, but the broader question of how this system of underground cities fits into the larger historical context of the communities that built and used it. The physical evidence tells us a great deal about how the underground city was built and how it functioned. It tells us considerably less about the specific historical episodes that drove its construction and use, which particular waves of threat prompted which phases of expansion. How the community organized the decision to descend and the decision to return to the surface what the experience of underground occupation meant to the people who went through it and to the generations that followed them. These are questions that sit at the boundary between archaeology and history and human experience. Questions that the physical evidence alone cannot fully answer, and that require the combination of material evidence, historical records, and careful interpretive reasoning to approach. The scholars working in this field are aware of both the richness of the questions and the limitations of the currently available evidence, and they proceed with the combination of enthusiasm and caution that good scholarship demands. Perhaps the most important thing to say about what we do not yet understand about Derinkuyu is simply this: the fact that we do not fully understand it is itself significant. It tells us that the people who built this place were doing something genuinely complex, something whose full dimensions resist easy comprehension even after decades of dedicated investigation. That is not a reason for speculation or invention. It is a reason for continued careful attention, the same kind of patient, methodical, evidence-based attention that the builders of Derinkuyu applied to their own extraordinary work. The tunnels are still there. The passages extend still into the cool and silent rock, waiting with the patience that belongs to stone, the patience of things that do not experience time the way we do, that simply persist, unchanged, through whatever happens above them. And the work of understanding them continues, slowly, carefully, and with the deep respect that this place and the people who built it deserve. Let us go back up now. Follow the passage as it slopes gently upward, the same passage we descended through so many chapters ago in the last dark minutes before dawn. The temperature rises slightly with each step. The absolute stillness of the deep levels gives way, gradually, to something a little less total, a faint suggestion of movement in the air, a barely perceptible increase in the ambient sound of the world above. Your footsteps echo forward and return as they did on the descent, but the echo now carries a quality that was not there before, something looser, slightly less contained, as though the stone around you is beginning, very gradually, to open. The passage curves. The ceiling rises by an almost imperceptible degree, and then, ahead of you, at a distance that is difficult to judge in the darkness, a pale rectangle of light, not dramatic, not suddenly, just a softening of the dark. A gradual accumulation of grey that resolves slowly into the unmistakable quality of early morning, the particular gentle light that belongs to the first hour after sunrise, when the sun has cleared the horizon, but has not yet climbed high enough to produce any harshness. When everything it touches appears to glow softly from within rather than to be illuminated from without. Step through the doorway, straighten up. Let the morning air move over your face, cooler than it will be in an hour, carrying the mineral clarity of the plateau, laced with the faint warmth of sunlight already falling on volcanic stone. The fairy chimneys catch the early light along their eastern faces, their pale tuff turning to warm amber and gold, while their western shadows remain a deep, soft blue. The village is stirring, a dog moves across a dusty lane, a door opens somewhere, the smell of bread baking drifts from an unseen oven. The sky above is vast and clear and blue, deepening toward the zenith and fading toward the horizon in the way that only high-altitude skies do, with a quality of depth that makes the air itself seem visible. It is morning in Cappadocia. And beneath your feet, beneath the lane, beneath the houses, beneath the vineyards and the vegetable gardens and the old stone walls and the fairy chimneys, the tunnels lie quiet and cool in their perpetual dark, as they have lain for centuries, patient and still and extraordinary. The story we have followed through these chapters is, in the end, a human story, not an alien story, not a magical story, not a story about impossible things. It is the story of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and responding with the most fundamentally human capacities available to them. Intelligence, community, faith, patience, and the willingness to do difficult work in the service of survival. The people who built Derinkuyu were farmers and craftspeople, priests and traders, parents and children and elderly grandparents. They were people who grew grapes and pressed olive oil and baked bread and gathered in churches to sing. They were people who argued about land boundaries and celebrated weddings and mourned their dead and told stories to their children in the evenings. They were, in all the ways that matter, recognizably like us, shaped by a different time and a different culture and a different set of circumstances, but driven by the same fundamental needs and the same fundamental capacities that all human beings share across every culture and every era. What set them apart, what produced the extraordinary thing that lies beneath this plateau, was the particular combination of circumstances they faced and the particular response those circumstances drew from them. They lived in a landscape that offered in its geology both the problem and the solution, a surface too exposed, too vulnerable to the moving dangers of history, and a subsurface perfectly suited. In the soft workability of its tuff and the stability of its underground temperature and the depth of its water table, to be transformed into a place of refuge. They recognized this opportunity. They developed the skills to exploit it. They accumulated the knowledge across generations to exploit it with increasing sophistication. And they maintained the communal organization and the shared commitment necessary to make the enterprise work, not once, but repeatedly across centuries of use. The faith that carried them underground, the Byzantine Christianity that shaped the underground church and the liturgical calendar, and the communal identity of the people who sheltered here, was not separate from the practical work of survival, but woven through it. The priest who celebrated the Eucharist in the lamplit underground church was as essential to the community's survival as the engineer who maintained the ventilation shafts, and both understood their work in terms of the same fundamental commitment to the continuation of the community. Faith and engineering, prayer and practical problem-solving, these were not opposites in Derinkuyu. They were complementary expressions of the same deep human determination to persist. The geological processes that created the tuff of Cappadocia operated across timescales of millions of years, processes so vast and so slow that the entire span of human civilization barely registers against them. The volcanic eruptions that deposited the ash from which the tuff was formed occurred long before any human being walked this landscape. The erosion that carved the fairy chimneys from that ash was underway long before any hand reached for a chisel and began to cut a doorway into the rock. The earth that became Derinkuyu was shaped by forces entirely indifferent to the human needs it would eventually serve. And yet, in one of those convergences that make geological and human history so endlessly interesting, those indifferent geological forces produced, in this particular place, precisely the material conditions that a particular community, in a particular period of historical pressure, needed to survive. The stuff was soft enough to carve with iron tools. It was hard enough to maintain its shape once carved. It was deep enough to provide the multiple levels the community needed. It maintained the temperature that made extended underground habitation practical. It sat above a water table accessible by wells. It produced, through the particular character of its erosion, a surface landscape whose concealment properties were an additional defensive asset. Whether this is coincidence or providence, whether the fit between the geological opportunity and the human need represents simply a fortunate alignment of circumstances or something more meaningful, is a question that belongs to philosophy and theology rather than to history or geology. But the fact of the fit is undeniable. This landscape was ready, in the most fundamental material sense, for the extraordinary use to which it was put. And the people who put it to that use were ready, in the most fundamental human sense, to recognize the opportunity and act on it. Think about what they left behind. Not in the sentimental sense of a legacy consciously intended for future generations, though the building of Derinkuyu was certainly, among other things, an act of intergenerational provision, of creating something that future members of the community could use and build upon. What they left behind in the most literal, physical sense is the city itself. The carved stone, the shaped ceilings, the worn floors, the lamp niches, the rolling stone doors, the ventilation shafts, the wells, the underground church with its east-facing apse. All of it is still there, in the cool and silent earth beneath this Cappadocian morning. They could not have imagined us, the people who would descend through their doorways 15 centuries later with electric lights and academic knowledge and camera equipment, and a set of questions they never thought to ask because the answers were simply part of living in the place. They could not have imagined that the city they built would survive them by so many centuries, or that people from the far ends of a world they did not know existed would one day stand in their carved rooms and feel across the gulf of all that time. A recognition of something fundamentally familiar, but perhaps they did not need to imagine us. Perhaps it is enough that they built well and built honestly and built in the service of a community they cared about deeply. The rest, the survival of the evidence, the eventual discovery, the ongoing work of understanding, followed from the quality of what they made, which was itself a consequence of the quality of who they were. A community is not simply a collection of individuals sharing a geography. It is a shared practice of mutual care, the decision, made and renewed across generations, to take responsibility for one another's survival and well-being. In Derinkuyu, that decision was made in stone. It was carved into the earth, level by level and corridor by corridor and chamber by chamber, across centuries of accumulated labor and accumulated knowledge and accumulated faith. It is, by any measure, one of the most remarkable expressions of communal human commitment in the archaeological record. And now the morning has fully arrived over Cappadocia. The sun has climbed above the eastern ridges, and its light falls across the plateau in long, warm horizontal sheets, illuminating the fairy chimneys from the side, casting long, clean shadows westward, turning the pale volcanic stone to colors that range from cream to gold to the warm gray of weathered tuff. The air has begun to warm. The village is fully awake now, voices, footsteps, the clatter of morning activity, the smell of bread and coffee and sunlit dust. A hawk circles above one of the larger fairy chimneys, its wings spread wide in the morning thermals, rising slowly without effort in the warming air. And beneath all of it, beneath the hawk and the fairy chimneys and the warm stone and the morning voices and the bread baking and the dog sleeping in the dusty lane, the tunnels lie in their cool and eternal quiet. The lamp niches in their walls are empty. The rolling stone doors rest in their open positions, motionless as they have been for centuries. The ventilation shafts carry the morning air downward in their slow convective drift. The wells reflect nothing in the darkness where no light reaches. The underground church faces east, as it always has, toward a sunrise that does not reach it, but that the people who worshipped there could feel, perhaps, in the simple fact of knowing it was there. Some doors protect a single room, others lead to an entire world. This one leads to both, to the cool, carved, lamplit world beneath the earth that kept thousands of people alive through centuries of danger, and to the warm, sunlit, open world above it, where those same people returned again and again, to plant their vineyards and rebuild their villages and raise their children and live their ordinary, extraordinary lives beneath the wide and generous sky of Cappadocia. Both worlds are still here, the sun above, the silence below. And between them, in a small stone doorway set into the base of a pale volcanic hillside, the threshold where fear and faith and engineering and community all meet, and where the most human of all stories continues, quietly, to be told. Thank you for watching History's Sleepy Time. This documentary has been written with care and deep respect for the historical, archaeological, and geological record of Cappadocia and the people who called it home. If this story brought you any peace, wonder, or quiet amazement tonight, we hope you carry it with you into sleep, and that somewhere in the cool and gentle dark behind your closed eyes, you can hear very faintly the soft echo of footsteps on carved stone descending into a world built entirely from human courage and human care. Good night.